So welcome to another episode of Sand Hill Road, the show where I talk to successful startup founders and their venture capitalists about the companies that they build and invest in. And the goal, like always, is to give you a little bit of a sense of what it's like to be in their shoes, how their businesses take and sometimes take a little bit of a deep dive. And today I'm super excited to announce our very special guest, Sid Sijbrandij, the co-founder of Gitlab.
Well, thanks for having me.
He's part of a very rare breed of European founders who've managed to build and scale successful breakout companies in the Valley. After recording this episode, Gitlab announced a 268 million Series E, valuing the company at $2.7 billion. Gitlab's journey from a simple open source repository to a $2.75 billion company is so unique and inspiring that I'm super honored to be able to share it with you today. So what does Gitlab do? A lot of people have first heard about Gitlab last year when Microsoft announced the $7.5 billion acquisition of GitHub.
This is a big deal, particularly in Microsoft's traditional approach to developers.
And if you remember, the open source community was shocked by this announcement. So what happened was that in the matter of a few hours, thousands of projects were pulled from GitHub over to GitLab. So from today's perspective, GitLab looks like a clear success story. It is a really late-stage player in the version control and DevOps space. And the last funding round brings the total amount raised to almost $440 million. They've raised from some of the best names in the Valley, including Khosla, August, and Khosla Ventures. And while the company could certainly stay private for a bit longer, they're actually planning to go public in 2020. I think it's going to be a direct listing. As I said, GitLab looks like a clear success story now, but like many great technology companies, GitLab's journey to commercial success was far from clear from the beginning. In fact, for a long time, it wasn't even clear whether GitLab would actually become a company. And herein lies much of the beauty of the GitLab story to me. In many ways, the GitLab journey epitomizes to me the open core software journey. So GitLab started as an open source project many miles away from Silicon Valley. Sid's co-founder Dimitri conceptualized the first version of GitLab in very humble beginnings in the Ukraine. Every day he had to walk out and get water from a well. He would come back with buckets of water and kept writing code. The project started out with the ability to manage Git repositories. Dimitri first worked on this project on his own, but only a year later he was already joined by more than 300 collaborators from all over the world. So at one point, Sid, who was living in the Netherlands, read on TechCrunch that Salesforce-like SaaS models would be the future.
I saw GitLab. It was a year old. Dimitri made it.
So he came up with this idea of building a SaaS layer on top of GitLab. So he emailed Dimitri saying, I'm going to build this, I'm going to make money off of your open source project. And Dimitri replied back, very chill, saying, yeah, that's fine with me. So for almost a year, they worked completely separately. Sid was building this commercial SaaS layer, while Dimitri was contributing to the open source project. So enough spoiler alerts, and let's hear it from Sid himself. I'm super excited to have today with me Sid Sijbrandij, who's the co-founder and CEO of Gitlab. And before I want to dive into the product and his founding journey, I want to learn a little bit more about Sid. So Sid, you weren't like the typical Silicon Valley, Stanford computer science dropout. You weren't even the European version of this. So in fact, you worked for a submarine company for 5 years of all places. And then you started Gitlab out of Amsterdam, of all places in the world, which I think when you started it, it wasn't really a huge tech hub. So tell me a little bit about this journey and how and when you realized that you really had to build this.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks for having me. Before GitLab, I did a bunch of things. I had a couple of companies, but I think the one that resonates most is where we started a company building recreational submarines. I wasn't a shareholder of that company, but I was the first employee, the first full-time person to work on it. I incorporated it. And by the time I left 5 years later, we built the most submarines. So today still, if you have a cruise ship or a big yacht and you want a submarine, you're probably going to use one from U-Boat Works. At the end, there were two things I wanted a couple of things I wanted to see. First of all, I wanted to see more growth. We were 15 people and it was growing, but not very fast. I want to see more profitability. We ran it, the company, because we were all very passionate about submarines, especially the inventor and or the investor, and I want to do something that was more profitable. And I saw this new programming language called Ruby on Rails, and or called Ruby, and the whole Ruby on Rails movement, and I was very intrigued, and I always wanted to get into programming, so I started learning programming, and that's how I became a developer and eventually saw Gitlab.
So maybe let's talk a little bit about the early days of Gitlab. So if I had to describe the early days, for me it's a little bit in version control language, like a pull and later merge. So in a way, there's this famous email that you wrote to Dimitri, your co-founder and the creator of Gitlab, that you were basically saying, I'm going to monetize on this and you're not going to be part of it. And then the even more famous reply of him saying, that's fine with me. I'm happy that someone is working on it. Tell me a little bit about this first year when you basically worked on it on your own. You were building on this open source project, but you were basically, I think you've never even met Dimitri. You only knew his avatar, and you basically you ventured out in the world and started to work on this. So tell me a little bit about this part of the journey.
Yeah, so I saw GitLab. It was a year old. Dimitri made it, and 200 people joined him in that effort. Like 200 people contributed to GitLab by then. And I thought this makes so much sense that something you collaborate with is something you can contribute back to. Makes sense for me but that would be open source. And I saw that you could download GitLab, but you could not use it as a web service. And I thought that's the future. Salesforce, everything I consume is now a website. I'm going to start the website for GitLab. And it should be easy. I just spin up GitLab, open it up for people. So I did a show Hacker News where I said, hey, this is my plan. Are people interested? And it didn't trend. So I went downstairs and started baking pancakes. And then it started trending. It ended up on the Hacker News homepage. And my now wife had to kind of finish the pancakes and bring them up to me. So thanks for that, because I was busy answering questions and learning about the market. I sent the email to Dimitri, hey, I'm going to do this. Hope you don't mind. He was totally cool with it. And I set up that first website and slowly kind of invited people. And we tried to keep the website online and fix all the problems that arose. After a year, I kind of was not doing so well with the website. People weren't prepared to pay for it, but there were a lot of people running GitLab themselves, and they were prepared to pay for features that they were missing. So when Dimitri tweeted out, "I want to work on GitLab full time," I hired him as a second employee and as a co-founder.
So let me drill in a little bit on these days when he joined. Before that, you were basically operating as two lone wolves in a way. He out of Ukraine, you out of the Netherlands. And then you basically, at this point, you knew you were going to join forces. So how is that feeling of like, I'm now going to work with the co-creator of this project that I've worked on it on a year trying to find product market fit for and like find a SaaS model. I think at that point it was a SaaS model.
Yeah, for that year, we didn't have a lot of interaction. I thought it was great. I thought it was great. We quickly agreed on kind of what he would earn every month, so that went very smooth. And from his perspective, he basically had two jobs. So he woke up in the morning, worked on GitLab, went to work, came back, worked on GitLab. So now that he was getting paid for his GitLab work, he could quit his previous job and focus on GitLab full time. So his life became a lot better.
And then did you meet, or was it all mainly digital in the beginning?
I think it was mainly email. We might have had an audio call. He wouldn't turn on his video, so I didn't know how he looked. And the reason I knew I sent the check to the right person was when the feature started landing in the master branch of GitLab.
Okay, that's interesting. You said you knew at this point after a year that customers wanted to have certain features and that that you knew that this was going to be the model. I looked at your Y Combinator application and there it seemed that you had already like massive traction, like 100,000 teams using it, 10,000 commits, 1 million ARR, 60% month-over-month growth. So how was that? Did you quickly land on this model, or was there still some trial and error going on in these early months?
Yeah, what we tried to do is keep it an open source project. So completely open source. We thought that was, I still think that would be the most beautiful thing to do. And we tried that in different ways. We tried donations. And when we, on the biggest month where we did a big drive, we got $1,000. And it wasn't even enough to pay for Dimitri, let alone for Dimitri, me, and Marin. So that didn't work. And we tried paid feature development. We basically started like that. Hey, you want a feature? We'll build it. Mm-hmm. But there was a big free rider problem where as soon as we told people that other companies were also interested in the same feature and they could split the cost, they were all reluctant to pay for it because they were kind of waiting till the other company would pay. And also, when they had to kind of get it approved internally, the company would say, look, we already have a contract for paid development. So if you want to pay for software development, you got to go with our preferred vendor. So we got these people that like, yeah, we want to help out with this preferred vendor and they'll make the feature, but the people weren't familiar with Gitlab. Sometimes he couldn't even do Ruby. So it didn't really help and it costed us more time and like zero income. So that wasn't working. And we tried to charge for like kind of installation and upgrades. But every time we kind of solved things, we changed the README, changed the documentation, made sure that everyone was helped, not just the customer paying for it. That caused basically for that demand to go away because we improved the installers and the documentation to a point that nobody needed help anymore. So people got a subscription with us for support, but then they didn't use it in a year and then they didn't renew. So slowly but surely we figured out, okay, we really need to charge for features because that's something where it's recurring. People will have to renew. It is super high margin, and that will allow us to scale as the demands on the software scale.
You bootstrap this all the way to this massive traction that I mentioned before. And so then at one point in 2014, you decide to move west and apply for Y Combinator as your first outside money to take in. You mentioned in the past that you were very skeptical of venture capital and that you said to your wife that if you want to raise money after YC, she should stop you just because of the difficult venture model that basically decreases the chances of success. It's either grow fast or die. So what was this decision to go from the bootstrapping mode to go into this Silicon Valley startup route?
Well, first of all, I've always been intrigued with Silicon Valley and the fast growth rate, and I was a visitor there. And we got an offer for $10 million in 2014, and it was like a one-liner to Dimitri, and he sent one word back, and we agreed that it wasn't for us. So we were clear about that, but we were like, okay, this has so much potential. We should give it a go and try Y Combinator. So we applied. We bootstrapped it up to that point, but I don't think we were at 1 million ARR, but we had over 100,000 companies using it, but mostly for free. So we weren't making a lot of money, but enough to sustain ourselves and slowly grow. And then Y Combinator was a huge boost. I think VC money, venture capital money is fine. I'm not skeptical of the model, but the thing is it greatly increases the average outcome, but it greatly decreases like the median outcome. The median outcome basically goes to zero. You're most likely to fail and end up empty-handed. The average outcome is greatly increased. So since as a founder, financially, like the median outcome is way more important. You want to end up with money, whether that's $1 million or $1 billion, it doesn't matter. Like as long as it doesn't matter that much. Like, but ending up empty-handed is not so nice. So
yeah, I agree.
um,
You're trading the mean for the variance.
yeah.
I heard that saying.
So we really had to we wanted to hire people in Silicon Valley with expertise without taking venture, but those people demanded stock options. And if you give out stock options at some point, they have to be worth something. There has to be a liquidity event, and the liquidity event, you basically can choose between being acquired or becoming a public company. Well, getting acquired is not very fun, so I want to become a public company, but that meant you have to get to a certain size by a certain date. So in a couple of years, we said, okay, we're going to give out stock options 2015. Then we want, in 5 years, we want to be a public company. Also because Dimitri's commitment was until 2021. So we put on our website, our aspiration was to become a public company by 2020.
Just let me dig a little bit deeper into this. How was this process of raising money for you? I mean, I think by that time when you were raising, we already had the 100 million A16Z round by GitHub. You had a lot of traction. People by that time already got the open core model. So how were these discussions? I mean, I imagine it being a little bit like a walk in the park, that you walk in and you go out with a term sheet, a fleece vest with your logo on it, Warrior front seat tickets. And I mean, you managed to raise from some of the best names like Khosla and August, I think, and Google Ventures. So but maybe I'm imagining that this was basically the dreamland. But at the same time, I think you were also, or that's something I wondered, you were already talking to people about the distributed nature of your teams, and how did that feed into the pitching process?
Yeah, so our first and second round, our seed and A, were we were still committed to becoming a boring company in every aspect possible. Like boring solutions is one of our values. So we wanted to just get an office. At YC, they told us like, remote works for engineering, but not for the other functions. So we purchased an office. And the first fundraising went really well. I think our first pitch was at a valuation of 7 million. Because at YC, they rightly said, look, you want to make sure you don't bounce off the atmosphere. So start with a low valuation, just keep increasing it. We thought, well, the companies at least were 10 million because that's what we were offered last year and we're doing way better. But we figured we need a first check. So we pitched at 7 million. And that investor was from Funders Fund. And they were so enthusiastic. We were like, okay, this is too low. So the second pitch I did at 9 million. And then we closed the 9 million. But then Funders Fund came back and said, well, we'll have to say no. So it was good that they seemed very enthusiastic, and it was okay. By that time, we closed at 9. So we kept increasing it. And over the course of 2 weeks, it crept up to 15 million. So kind of doubled over 2 weeks. And then the Funders Fund came back and said, I couldn't sleep about this. Can we still invest? I'm like, well, that's totally cool. Well, but the problem is the valuation more than doubled. And they did something that I thought was really shows how analytical you have to be. Like at that point, when you sign, you basically have to take the loss. Like you could have done this at this. You basically lose that money as soon as you have to acknowledge you kind of wasted that money as soon as you sign. And you don't know whether it's going to return a profit yet. But they did it, and so far that turned out for the better. After YC, I planned 1 month in the US to do the fundraising and then go back to the Netherlands. And I was kind of done in 2 weeks. So I asked Kassar, our mentor from YC, what I should do. He's like, well, lots of companies fail because they can't raise an A round. So if you can, raise one now, so you don't have that problem. Like, okay, that makes sense. Khosla already did half of our seed round, and we negotiated an A round with them. So in 1 month, we've gotten both rounds done, and luckily ended up hiring a great CFO, Paul Mackel, who's still with the company, who did those 2 rounds and flipped the company from a Dutch to a US one.
Wow, that's incredible to go from an unpriced round to the first priced round, where basically then I think you mentioned that you had the first term sheet on a 9 million cap, and then the second one on a 15 million, and then they converted at different prices, I assume, right?
Yeah, 9, 12, and 15, I think, were the numbers.
Now you're on this VC route, and these people expect you to have an office and hire staff, salespeople, and an engineering team in San Francisco. And at one point you decide, well, we're doing kind of okay being a remote distributed company. How did these discussions go with investors?
Yeah, so it kind of happened over time. So people kind of stopped showing up at the office because they could as well work from home. Yes. We never made them. And then every time an executive joined, they were like, okay, this works for X. This works for salespeople. It doesn't work for SDRs, who are mostly like recently graduates, and they need to learn a lot, and they need the enthusiasm of each other. So we're like, okay, cool. Well, just feel free to hire them here. And then they found some amazing SDRs in Utah. Oh, what you're going to do? Are you going to hire the great people, or are you going to settle for something for not so great people in San Francisco who also tend to be more expensive? So over time, every time they were skeptical, but then that same leader was very happy not to have a 4-hour commute every day anymore from Sacramento to San Francisco. So it kind of solved itself. Investors rightly made us promise to keep an open mind about it. If it would fail at scale, to reconsider it. And we always said, yeah, we'll keep an open mind. We have our values, but on our values page, you'll not find remote or all remote. That's not one of our values. It's an outcome, maybe, of some of our values, but not an input. And I just when we raised our B round, I just spoke to an investor yesterday who declined our B round, because what they did is they looked at it, and the most likely outcome for any company is to get acquired. And they called a couple of corp dev people and said, look, this is a remote company. How do you feel about acquiring them? And these are the usual suspects in acquisition land, let's say the oracles of the world. They said, look, we're not going to do that. That's so hard to integrate. We're not going to do that. And they passed on our B. At August, there was a lot of skepticism as well. And there were 2 things. So first of all, they know they would get a discount on an acquisition, and they figured about 50%. So half the valuation, because there's no people to move over. They could live with that. Look, the goal was to go for an IPO, and even if it failed, even at a 50% discount, it was looking like a good deal. The second thing was, are they going to be able to manage the company? So Vili Ilchev invited me to give a presentation about that. He said, we're concerned, please address it, which is great. All the other VCs, or many of them, just passed without giving us a chance to explain. So I came in with a deck, explained all the different things we were doing. And then, okay, still concerned. And then one of the associates said, look, I went online, I looked at their handbook that Sid is talking about, and it's amazing. It's the best thing I've ever seen. This is the best run company we've ever seen. This makes sense. So
I'm so fascinated about this. There's a theory of the firm, and I think you're not only challenging how software is developed, but at the same time, you're challenging how an organization can be run. For example, today, when I tried to find out about the shadow program, CEO shadow program, I could find it in the handbook. Yeah, it's so amazing to have a company laying out every granular steps of how it works and operates. So maybe let's move on a little bit to the product. Let's start with the basics of the product. I think you mentioned once, which I think was really interesting in comparing it to GitHub. You mentioned that GitHub is in many ways closed source software used for open source projects, while GitLab is open source, but it is often used to develop proprietary software. Was this always the plan, or did this sort of evolve over time in terms of the product?
Yeah, I think what happened is that GitHub had a focus on hosting open source projects. It was something the founders were very proud about. And Dimitri was working at a consultancy, and he was focusing on his own use case. And from then on, most of the people starting to use GitLab were using it in kind of an enterprise setting. So we focused on that enterprise use case. And what's happening now is that companies are switching from kind of agile development to DevOps, where development and operations are integrated. They all found that they need like 15, 20 different applications to do that. And they all picked their preferred point solutions and then tried to integrate all of them into their homegrown DevOps platform. And what they're finding is that they don't have enough visibility across the entire pipeline. And this is all the way from planning what you're going to do, writing the code, to securing that, monitoring that, the packaging, everything else. And GitLab is coming in as a single application that can replace that homegrown solution. And people are finding that their cycle time is greatly reduced. They can go much faster from deciding what to do to delivering it to users, measuring the response, and then having input for their next iteration. And, we kind of got lucky that the enterprise market in that sense was underserved. And it wasn't intuitive to us that a single application would be better. It took someone in the company, Camille, to stand up and say that, and us giving that a try and finding out it was really better.
Today you have a broad range of products competing with the likes of Jira, JFrog's Artifactory. I think in the beginning it was just source control, and then I think the first additional feature you made was the CI, and now you have like all kinds of features, including security, monitoring, and the whole DevOps side, as you said. I had Joseph Jacks on the program a couple of weeks ago, and I think you had a discussion with him once where you basically talked about the value capture of open source projects. And given that you have so much surface of the product, you can afford, in a way, to capture minimum value, whereas if you were focusing on just one tiny problem set, you would have to basically capture much more value to get it to profitability. So maybe talk a little bit about this, how this expanded, the product range expanded, and how you think about this value capture in commercial open source software in general.
Yeah, so I think you put it really well, because we do everything from managing the entire process and planning up to verifying, releasing, configuring, monitoring, defending it. That's an enormous market. And where competitors for monitoring will have to charge per gigabyte in order to build a giant company, we can take a very small rake, a very small piece of the pie and still be a giant company. And I think that's a superpower. Also, it felt like a year ago, it felt like it might have been too ambitious, but we're seeing that we're able to integrate everything into a single application, which is a bit counterintuitive, but it also helps us to differentiate from stringing a bunch of point solutions together, and it allows us to hire great people who are passionate about that. So kind of the ambition has really helped, both with like the addressable market and not having to capture a lot, but also with selling the product, marketing the product, and hiring great people.
Let's focus on one particular trend that I've noticed in your product, which is that you've really doubled down on the Kubernetes ecosystem, the container orchestration system. Obviously, this is an open source project initiated by Google. One of your large investors is Khosla Ventures, and when the Microsoft acquisition of GitHub was announced last year, you also moved all the Gitlab.com SaaS infrastructure from Microsoft Azure to GCP. How do you think about this relationship with this giant?
Yeah, so we're very happy with our relationship with GCP, Google Cloud Platform, but we're also happy with the relationship we have with all the other cloud providers, basically, except for Microsoft, AWS, Salesforce, many others are now that GitHub is part of Azure and Azure DevOps. For example, Salesforce DX, their conference for developers, is now kind of, we did a big session about how GitLab is a great way to make Salesforce applications. Although we want to be cloud agnostic, we want to have a great way to deploy to Azure as well. But we're seeing that like the collaboration in the field with salespeople, the salespeople of all the Microsoft's competitors are now more open to collaborating with us and getting kind of workflow portability for customers with the help of GitLab. Kubernetes came at the right time for us. We were trying to make sure that you can just write your code. GitLab does the rest. We call that auto DevOps. We package it up. We figure out what tests need to be run. We make sure it's secure. Everything else. Also want to deploy it, roll it out gradually, etc. And all of the environments our customers had were different. And then Kubernetes came along and kind of commoditized that space where it's a single API. You want to do a deploy, just tell Kubernetes to do the deploy and point it to the GitLab container registry. That makes things a lot simpler. And want to make sure that if you want to do DevOps, all you need is a cluster and GitLab, and you have it done end to end. You don't need any other tools. It's been great, and we're seeing that customers are increasingly demanding from their public cloud that they offer great Kubernetes clusters, and the customers can take care of the rest.
If you could dream a little bit in terms of product, that you could have GitLab for music, video, design sketches. Basically, if you could dream of what GitLab could become in terms of the company for source control.
Yeah, so our mission is everyone can contribute. And we want people to be able to contribute to the company. Like, hey, you read on our CEO Shadow program. If there's something on that page that's wrong, you can send us a request to change it. We want people to contribute to GitLab itself. Over the last half year, the number of contributions to GitLab doubled, with now over 200 a month, 200 improvements a month that are coming from the wider community. And last but certainly not least, we want people to kind of use GitLab to make things better. Right now, that's software. And what's possible now in software is that someone doesn't have to invite you to improve something. As long as you can see it, as long as you can see your code, you can contribute to it. And I hope that will become available not just for software, but many other things. Aston Kutcher is an investor in GitLab, and with him we talked about, if you have a movie, right now you get the final edit. What if you can get all the individual camera feeds and all the editing information and all the audio tracks, and you could remix it yourself. You could maybe make a slightly different cut or make an improvement. You can send that back. So instead of like 3 people in a studio in a couple of weeks making an edit, you can have all these remixes of things. I think that'd be interesting. I think if I look at my desk, all the hardware that's there, if I have a better idea, I cannot send something back. Like, all those formats are not conducive to that. I hope we can change those formats where you can suggest an improvement. And there are movements like open hardware where things like that are starting to happen.
That's so cool. I really love that product vision. So final question. You were one of the very few companies publicly announced a date for going public. So what does this journey look like in the next year? I mean, you're obviously the most transparent company out there, but how do you feel about this process of gearing up for the public?
Yeah. So going public is a combination of an ambition we set a long time ago, but also we think it fits us. It's as a public company, it almost implies the transparency. And it will be a way for us to tell our story on reach more people. Like, our biggest problem is awareness. People think we do source control, even though we do 10 times more than that today. We think going public will help with that. And we also look forward to kind of the operational discipline you have to have as a public company. We think that's a healthy way to operate. I think us being remote forced us to do things you should do anyway, but do them earlier. And I hope the same will be true with hopefully becoming a public company.
Okay, wonderful. Last thing, call to action. Where can people find out more about you and find out more about Gitlab?
Yeah, so Gitlab, Gitlab. If you Google it, you'll find everything you need to know. You can sign up for an account. You can view our website, contribute to our source code. If you're a watcher of this program, you're a bit curious about like how we run the company, you can Google GitLab Handbook. We have a public handbook of over 3,000 pages. And if you're more into video, there's a channel called GitLab Unfiltered on YouTube, and it contains a lot of our calls. So if you want to attend the meeting at GitLab, go there to join one.
Okay, wonderful. So this is it for today. So I hope you found this episode as exciting as I did. I really loved recording it. Sid Sijbrandij is such a great guy. He's so open, he's so approachable, and I'm really looking forward to follow their journey. And if you want to hear more about what I'm up to, you can always subscribe to my newsletter on sandhillroad.io, or just subscribe to the channel and tune in next time. It's up to you. Cheers, guys.